Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Just quickly to say, we're going to give a couple more minutes just to let latecomers join in before we go ahead and get started. So we'll start in about 2 or 3 minutes, I think. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to ICCT's live briefing on countering violent extremism, the need for new direction. My name is Julie Coleman. I'm a senior research fellow and the lead for ICCT's program on PCVE. And quickly, before we start today's session, I just want to give a bit of a background about ICCT for those who may be in attendance, but who are perhaps less familiar with our organization. We're an independent think tank based in The Hague who offer evidence-based policy recommendations and implementation of practical solutions-oriented programs related to counterterrorism and PCVE, with a particular focus on the rule of law and human rights. Some very brief housekeeping notes before we start the session today. After the three panelists that we have today have spoken, we're going to have about 30 minutes of Q&A. So I strongly encourage you to go ahead and submit any questions that you may have using the Q&A function on Zoom throughout the entire presentation. No need to wait until the end of the session. And if we have time and the technological capabilities, which I believe should all work out smoothly, we're going to try to see if we can have some people give their questions live, so handing over the microphone, so to speak. In addition to answering all of those questions that we have, I wanted to mention that we do have a recording of this briefing that will be made available on ICCT's YouTube page. So if anybody misses any of these sessions, it will be accessible later on there, and just be aware that it is being recorded. I also just want to take the opportunity to mention that ICCT has 2 webinars taking place next week. And so I encourage you to either look at our website or our social media channels to find out information about registering for those events. And lastly, we just ask that you help us improve our future live briefings. At the end of the briefing, when you go to leave, there'll be a pop-up with a very short survey that we just ask you to fill out, give us a little bit of feedback about our briefing so we can continue to improve those every time. So with that housekeeping out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So it's our pleasure to be hosting this session today, which will be led by Professor Tahir Abbas of Leiden University. Tahir is an associate professor at the Institute of Strategic and Global Affairs at Leiden University, and his research interests include ethnicity, social conflict, Islamophobia, and radicalization. He's extensively published on all of those topics, and I'm sure most, if not everybody in attendance today is very familiar with Tahir's work. His most recent publication is a book, Countering Violent Extremism, the International De-Radicalization Agenda, and that's going to be sort of the backbone of today's session. He's going to go into more details and information about the book and his findings, so I will defer to him and leave it to him to go into that further. But before passing over the microphone to Tahir, I also wanted to take the opportunity to introduce the other discussants who will be joining the panel today. First of all, we have Daniela Pisiu, who is a senior fellow at the Austrian Institute of International Affairs. And then we also have Tufail Chowdhury, who's an associate professor at Durham Law School and senior research fellow at the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law. We were originally supposed to have a third discussant today, Elizabeth Pearson of the Violence and Terrorism Research Center at Royal Holloway University in London. She's unfortunately unable to join us today, but I have no doubt that with the three distinguished panelists that we have, it's going to be a really engaging session. So with that said, I will leave it there and I will go ahead and pass the floor over to Tahir. Over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, the ICCT, for organizing the event. And thank you all for taking part in this online realm, which isn't necessarily ideal, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to have so many people in attendance to hear what I'm about to say. So indeed, the backdrop is the publication of this book, which looks a bit fuzzy at the moment, but it's Countering Violent Extremism. And it was published by Bloomsbury earlier in the year. And so it's really trying to talk about what is CVE in terms of some of the problems it raises for effective policy making in the area of radicalization and de-radicalization. And where do we go from here if we think that the CVE paradigm as we know it is somewhat limited? We do have a new administration in the form of President Biden, and there have been some utterances around where some of this might go, but we also have then the legacy of the war on terror in terms of Afghanistan and the implications of what's happening there for the region and what we think more generally about CVE. So we'll spend about half an hour going through some of the points around these issues, and hopefully it will open up an opportunity for a further discussion. So it's been 2 decades since the onset of the war on terror that began after the events of 9/11. But across the world today, there is a prevailing approach to countering violent extremism, CVE, that proposes a top-down, state-centric perspective on the problems of violent extremism and how to counter it. However, such methodologies have adverse effects, including adding to stigmatization, Islamophobia, as well as fueling far-right and radical right sentiment that centers on anti-Muslim framing. So the consequences of the current dominant CVE paradigm is that it disproportionately focuses on the problems of ideological pull factors. The implications are that it takes attention away from structural push factors that habitually underpin the realities across the world. In the process, it limits individual agency and sustains the status quo concerning CVE. More crucially, the opportunity to critique domestic and foreign policy as it pertains to its impact, in particular on Muslim minorities in the global north, delegitimizes certain forms of resistance, including a rightful critique of current state practices. So the 9/11 events, which are just coming up to 2 decades, gave considerable rise to a focus on issues of terrorism, radicalization, and political violence across the world. Significant investment into these questions by governments, academia, and civil society groups endures to this day. However, sustainable solutions are difficult to achieve in the light of rapid ongoing developments. Globalization, localization, economic inequality, political polarization due to the hollowing out of the center ground politically, as well as the rise of issues such as populism, authoritarianism, and nationalism have created unprecedented challenges. But while much of the academic and policy-oriented scholarship has fixated on the causes of violent extremism and its solutions, these approaches have been programmatic, responding to predetermined policy directives that converge on objectives that are less about the long-term needs and wants of local communities and more about the short-term national and international security priorities. There's also a charged atmosphere relating to reporting on terrorism, which creates judgments and actions laced with an emotionality that affects objectivity and reflexivity across the sphere of influence and action. It leads to protracted ideas and practices, creating numerous implications, specifically for issues of trust and engagement. While the nature of the terrorist threat is always in question, CVE solutions in some cases can lead to the worsening of outcomes, whether it is domestically in Europe or internationally, as in the case of Afghanistan. Taking these concerns on board, there is a need to propose a critical, grounded, and community or directed attention to detail that moves beyond the cursory notion that terrorists are dissimilar from the rest of society. There's also a concern around the conceptualization of radicalization, which is seen as a precursor to violent extremism and terrorism. While very much unresolved, it effectively amalgamates theory, policy, and practice in very indistinct terms. However, it's clear enough that radicalization occurs in a social context. But there is a much needed discussion and debate on the wider societal dimensions of radicalization, extremism, and political violence that is missing in policy development, although it exists very much among academics in general. So in this talk, I want to take a 20-year gaze on a range of concerns since the event of 9/11, in particular, the need to deconstruct historical and social structures that lead to extremism, the problems of wider social attitudes that relate to the normalization of Islamophobia and social conflict in general, and a lack of sufficient analysis on mental health and public mental health perspectives, which are becoming increasingly recognized as important, although they've been in play very much throughout this time. We've also created a set of industries to do with radicalization, de-radicalization, and yet we are all still puzzling over the issues of cause and effect, taking attention more often than not away from deeper historical and structural matters that do or do not affect people and their paths to extremism. So the war on terror began 20 years ago, and while the language has shifted, the idea of a perpetual conflict against terror and terrorism in Europe in particular, and across the global north and global south in general, is considered normal. But today's terrorism concerns itself with many more conundrums than it might have done in the past, namely the far right and the alt-right. But underpinning most afflicted young and older people are issues of social exclusion, including mental health concerns, which are only now beginning to be taken seriously. Now, the idea of social exclusion and mental health problems affecting young Muslims in Europe for the last 20 years, however, have remained invisible to policymakers until very recently. What has also endured since the war on terror and has been enhanced by it is Islamophobia. While this historically embedded Orientalism predates the war on terror, it has now an even greater impact than it did before its acceleration 2 decades ago. Today's Islamophobia feeds off well-projected, commonly held racialist and culturalist tropes about Muslims. But there are also specific considerations to do with social media, mainstream politics, and everyday popular culture that normalizes anti-Muslim sentiment, not just in Europe, but across the world. So in the last 2 decades, we've seen quite a rapid spread of thinking, in particular on the question of radicalization. However, its meaning is still contested. For some, it's seen as a source of confusion. For others, it's seen as a buzzword used by political elites. For others still, it's a total nightmare to operationalize. There are questions about its scientific rigor and whether or not it's plagued by assumption, intuition, and conventional wisdom. There's an emphasis on the fact that it emphasizes individual and psychological processes, consequently placing too great an emphasis on ideological and theological interpretations at the expense of social and political considerations. Islamist radicalization is portrayed as a sickness that rapidly spreads these dangerous beliefs across populations, which precludes any detailed explanation of the precise developments that occur from forming beliefs to committing acts of violence, if such a relationship can be fully articulated at all. But we've also seen a bit of a critical turn in radicalization studies, which highlight the negative effects of radicalization discourses in terms of the securitization and the suspect community paradigm, which all focus on the racialization of the stereotypical Muslim. While radicalization as an idea has proven unsatisfactory and it needs reframing, there still is no universal theory, and theorization is often without any empirical content. And in the wider field, the state-centric approach, seen as sufficient justification for CVE itself, is back to front. It's based on the claims of the likelihood of radicalization as a function of inherent individual or group characteristics or traits. Rarely are issues of post-colonialism, race, gender, or class addressed. The sensitive issues relating to questions of power, representation, and participation in society are written out due to the policy's top-down agenda. Let's try and open up some case scenarios here. Consider the cases of young Moroccan men from the Netherlands or young Pakistani men from the UK who find themselves on a path to radicalization, however we understand that. Now, in thinking through issues of de-radicalization, we might applaud the situation of any young man or individual per se who has reversed their radicalization and sought greater comfort in their position as a citizen of society, viewing the possibility of greater participation as a solution to their isolation and exclusion. The latter, enhanced by the radicalizing effect of online content, converges on people's sense of the lack of identity and other vulnerabilities associated with it. Although not all who view this content converge on violence as a reaction to it. Although it's very clear that historically and to this day that radicalizers use the language of exclusion and Islamophobia to recruit. And this obviously connects with people's real world experiences. But in terms of policy thinking, we don't really connect closely enough to that framing itself. And so while we might see some kind of reversal of radicalization as some kind of success, it pays little heed to the wider implications of being a Muslim minority in the Netherlands or in the UK in today's world. Nor does it consider the numerous existential realities that create mental health problems, as well as a sense of malaise due to the general experience of vilification and marginalization. Exclusionary factors such as these limit the participation of individuals in society. Entry points into the issues that lead a person to seek redemption, recognition, or belonging within narrowly framed ideological platforms as outcomes are, in reality, the solutions to the struggles that these young people face as they see them. These ideological turns are not the quandaries in themselves, but factors beyond a focus on ideology are habitually removed from understandings of extremism and radicalization. Radicalization, effectively, is a social phenomenon, a social outcome, and consequently, a social process. Society creates the conditions for the vulnerable to fall through the cracks and enter a situation where their sense of themselves reduces to such an extent that they can believe the unbelievable. Now, 20 years ago, many of us, probably quite a few of us here as part of this, watched on the television news as the planes hit the Twin Towers on that fateful Tuesday in September 2001. For many of us working in this field, we could imagine a foreseeable future where the Muslim world and the world of Muslims would remain of intense fascination to Western policy makers and commentators. Moreover, this attention would potentially have potentially severe implications for Muslim minorities across the global north and Muslim majorities in the global in the south. Islamophobia, in terms of how we see it today, had its defining moments, if you like, during the mid-1990s with the rise of the Taliban and the Bosnian War. That was a real important period for the development of Islamophobia in Europe. But we've seen all of this. I mean, of course, we had experiences of radicalization before 9/11 also. But it's the period since then that we've seen the acceleration of both different kinds of radicalizations, that is Islamist and far right, but also the nature, the outcome, the processes of of Islamophobia, which has led to, fast forward today, to issues of securitization through the normalization of this very same Islamophobia. For example, we have legislation that hinders Muslim women's cultural and religious expression. We have bans, minaret bans in Europe. We have cartoons that mock significant Muslim religious symbols for mocking sake. And the digital surveillance realm is now the new normal, whether it is online or through the eyes of face recognition cameras everywhere. The war on terror has normalized the securitization of societies and regularized the existence of Islamophobia. This has increased the likelihood of radicalization, not reduced it. And these are counter-terrorism policies that have domestic implications. And in terms of foreign policy, there are ongoing questions to consider. Afghanistan is mired in complex, multifaceted conflicts that have had much to do with the presence of external actors. 20 years on from the war on terror, and now that the US and the allies have left the country, the Taliban have returned to absolute power with an uncertain and unclear future. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, motivated by a geostrategic interest in the Middle East with non-existent weapons of mass destruction used as a justification, caused Iraq to descend into chaos once it was invaded in 2003, with the contagion still affecting Syria to this day. It became the precursor to the emergence of the so-called Islamic State just over a decade after 9/11. For many, the war on terror has been an unmitigating disaster, but one that was predictable at the outset because the war in Afghanistan was motivated by revenge and supported by unrestrained weaponry. The fall of Kabul in 2021 was reminiscent of the fall of Saigon in 1975. So preventing and countering violent extremism, or its precursor, the even more nebulous term de-radicalization, have put the cart before the horse. The essential assumption in the case of Muslim extremists is that Islamist radicalization and violent extremism come from within the religion. And therefore, if it is possible to limit the effects of the ideological pull of extremism, there will be less likelihood of young Muslims or older Muslims the world over joining organizations and taking part in spreading hate or taking part in violent extremist endeavor. Such a methodological framework takes agency away from individual or group actors whose motivations may well be more to do with their perceptions and experiences relating to the idea of seeking justice or recognition, or having no choice but to respond to violence with violence. Rather than seeing violence to do with the abuses of power at the hands of individuals, governments, or corporate interests, radicalization is seen to be a function of those who follow a religion or ideology that is at best seen as rigid. It's also seen as dogmatic, uncompromising, and inherently promoting violence. This misconception of radicalization increases Islamophobia that has the knock-on effect of increasing radicalization. But hitherto, state authorities have continued to look to the religion for answers, such as delegitimizing certain interpretations, reframing jihadism as ideas within Islamic poetry that can be retaught, using stratcoms, or strategic communications, i.e. alternative narratives, but not declared as to what end, or combating online content as a way to deal with the harms before they appear, but all with little measurable impact. While both the effort and the investment are to a particular degree necessary, the impact has been limited due to its content. In reality, most Muslims across the globe face all sorts of genuine social pressures. Most people are mobilized into violence because of a lack of choice, not through choice per se. While the ideologues, and these are the people who are the smart and the strong and who use the vulnerabilities that people have to exploit them, while they are problematic and possess numerous tools at their disposal, they are relatively rare relative to the ordinary young man and the few young women who join extremist organizations for local reasons, but project their ambitions nationally or globally. In this way, signing up to extremist groups is an expression of their agency. We also know how this works in relation to far-right groups. We know of cases of far-right groups, individuals rather, being provided employment because it's a means of income for jobless individuals, which then makes it a much more an effective path for being able to spread far-right hate and ideology. In some cases, the young jihadi who joined the Islamic State in Iraq or Syria was no different. Cases reported of those who went to Iraq or Syria, but if they could speak French, Arabic, or English and could program a movie maker on a MacBook Pro, they would command a reasonable salary. So in that respect, it was a job for also the jobless, the Tunisians, the many thousands of Tunisians who went over shortly after the collapse of the government there did so on the basis of helping their Sunni brothers against a corrupt government. But it was only later that this morphed into what might be described as Islamic State and its various tentacles. So there are these structural issues that affect the lived realities of people who take part in these endeavors, whether it's European-born Muslims or across the Middle East and the Global South more generally. We tend to completely omit those from much of our analysis here. We also realize that in Europe, there's a particular class system that embeds inequalities within elite discourses, continuing to separate working class groups, preventing them from organizing together against dominant interests of capital. Capitalism, or rather, the capitalism and racism have a habit of reinventing themselves, and the two are fundamentally aligned. So we have a very protracted policy development landscape. The dominant CVE policy agenda has taken the experiences of specific individuals and framed a popular narrative around the idea that an ideological awakening appears among those who have anxieties over identity and belonging. However, this generalization is too broad. It only concentrates on ideology as the pull factor. It does not explore the push factors that take people along a path that allows for easy exploitation. In the case of young individuals who go through a process of being radicalized and then de-radicalized successfully, we don't always know their background story or personal life issues that may or may not have had a role to play. We only presume to know about the wider social context in which their identities are being shaped. Indeed, it is very much the case that it is a problem that we have young people who seek violent solutions by surfing online and finding substance in problematically framed narratives. However, at the same time, we must understand that it takes considerable effort for a person to arrive at this situation. Moreover, in every case of individuals involved in radicalization, mental health concerns do emerge. In particular, issues such as schizophrenia, ADHD, Asperger's syndrome, and other illnesses across the autism spectrum. Therefore, there are always individual level trigger points that help to connect the intersection between the push and pull factors relating to any individual experience. These are all ongoing research questions, and we're still interested in the interaction between the push and the pull, and in particular where the level of the question of mental health also enters into the picture. So what's now the case beyond the war on terror? Where do we go from here? So let me try and summarize in that the war on terror continues to exist, even if the nomenclature has shifted. However, the emergence of the far-right, alt-right, and groups such as the incels in the last few years have now raised new questions for the CVE milieu. Concerns to do with radicalization and violent extremism will continue to be important, not because they are about a religion, but because they refer to structural disadvantage and inequality. We have seen over the last 2 decades that inequalities have widened across the world, including in prosperous countries. These inequalities lead to social divisions, transformed into deeper polarizations through a political language reproduced by uncritical media, which leads to the ongoing framing of minorities and outsiders, not just as a perpetual annoyance, but also a security threat. There is also a view that the religion of Islam and Muslims themselves are the specific cultural, political, and social issues of our time. As Muslim minority populations continue to grow relative to majorities, and as the Muslim numbers across the world grow relative to others, there will be a sense that our, i.e. majority liberties, freedoms, and values and norms will be threatened by the very existence of these minority others. All this stems from a racist, neoliberal, and secular logic of the war on terror, with acute Islamophobia its biggest consequence. Islamophobia will continue to be a challenge for the near future, and this will have implications for the radicalization of not just younger would-be jihadis, but also far-right extremists. With the rise of far-right extremism, the debate now among numerous government departments is the question of whether existing CVE programs fit the challenges created by this form of extremism, or if a new approach is needed. However, from a societal perspective, the push factors are the same for disillusioned Muslims. But the challenge is how to deal with a security issue with an enemy that is othered, i.e. Islam and Muslims are not indigenous because they are from out there, to one that is from us, i.e. the majority, and looks like us. It also needs to shift from an issue that is based on the threat from a minority, i.e. Muslims, to being a threat from a majority group that threatens the same majority, i.e. Anglo-Saxons in the Northwest European landscape. This presents many political challenges. It raises the question of the relationship between CVE and counter-terrorism that has mired engagement with Muslims. Is the white majority now potentially a threat from being radicalized? Does the white majority population now become securitized? If not, why not? And should CVE work be mainstream within government departments so that it becomes an everyday matter rather than something outside and distinct from considerations to, for example, safeguarding school children? What about changing names? The Australian Security Intelligence Organization, for example, has suggested using, quote, ideologically motivated violent extremism and religiously motivated extremism. So somehow there's a distinction being made, but critics have argued that this is another way of avoiding talking about far-right extremism. The US has now shifted its focus on countering domestic terrorism to reflect the very real presence of domestic terrorists as opposed to an ideology that has come from out there, which is a step in the right direction of regarding the problem as their own, not an imported problem. This is all shifting terrain, but it does appear that the realities of the far-right threat, which we all now know is greater than we've ever known it, and that in some cases it's a greater threat than Islamist extremism, the far-right threat has made governments think again in relation to existing CVE and CT strategies. There's also the question of what happens next in relation to the Taliban. The impact it could have on Islamists in and for the stability of Pakistan are real concerns. India will no doubt be exploring the consequences for its national security. A potentially emboldened Al-Qaeda or Islamic State in the region is also a possibility. Will Afghanistan once again become the destination for disillusioned young Muslims wishing to live in a true Islamic emirate? Some European-born Muslims have welcomed the return of the Taliban, but these are not extremist Muslims. Muslims, in fact, here who are critical of Western influence in the region, at the same time as being sympathetic to the idea of Islamic rule. But this poses another set of problems around freedom of speech and its curtailment by governments if the Taliban are designated a terrorist organization in the near future. We need a new way of thinking about radicalization in CV, one that examines these issues in a wider social context, exploring questions at the level of the individual and their wider experience in society and its institutions to get a richer and honest account of what goes wrong and right. If we continue to center on the sharper end of concerns when there is an orthodoxy to defeating terrorism, the war on terror, however we call it, will continue to make the mistakes of old. It will allow the challenges of the new to escape for another generation of counter-terrorism, counter-extremism, and CVE thinkers, policymakers, and practitioners. A measured attempt at determining an appreciation of radicalization that is rooted in experience and practice, where its application is on real-world tests, with the understanding of the question determined by grounded conceptualization is essential. There are both worthy and flawed reasons to hold radical perspectives, which are all subjective, but they need to be considered in context, all the while noting that it's the few who turn to radicalization and the even fewer who turn to violent extremism. So thank you again for tuning into that. That's the essence of the argument contained in the book, Countering Violent Extremism, available at all good bookstores. And we need a rethink, and we need a rethink that focuses on bottom-up, grounded understandings, empirically led approaches to solutions that are well-tested, rather than the top-down, state-centric, predetermined notion of what works or should work, and all the various systems of governance that have been established around it. I hope all of that made some sense, and that I look forward to your comments, observations, and thoughts shortly. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Tahir. That was really thought-provoking, and I'm sure already I can tell you there's a lot of questions coming in, so we'll make sure to reserve a good amount of time at the end to have that Q&A. But perhaps now I can hand the floor over to Daniela for your thoughts on Tahir's remarks and your thoughts more generally about what is needed right now for CVE and its approach.
Well, thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for the invitation. I very much enjoyed the book, I must say, from the very beginning. I think it's a really tour de force, starting from definitions, historical perspectives, over to how radicalization occurs and how then CVE relates, or rather doesn't relate, to these insights that we have from research. What I wanted to do today is basically three things. One, to point out a couple of items, a couple of insights, which for me were particularly thought-provoking. Then play a little bit of a devil's advocate and ask some hopefully tricky questions, or I don't know, we'll see. And then I have a couple of issues that popped out as you were talking just now. I didn't actually have them noted down, but from the presentation, I felt I had to chip in into those things a little bit as well. So turning first of all to these items, food for thought. First, so basically talking about this focus on ideology that you mentioned, as opposed to, structural causes. Basically, what I had to think about at this point was how CVE, and I think you kind of said this in the book as well, but just to perhaps strengthen the argument a bit more, or make it more clear in this respect, it seems that CVE is basically either looking at individuals or masses, right? So we want to either radicalize individuals, or we talk about Muslims as such, as it was. There's something about religion, there's something about ethnicity. And what we're missing, of course, is the one thing in between, which is the social movement. You kind of make this point, but I think it's perhaps important to emphasize it even more, because it's something that probably the system has been doing badly for a while now. So thinking about other subcultures, for example, as well, subcultures also in the past weren't necessarily political. Usually the approach was either to ignore them or to criminalize them, but we don't really have a way of dealing with them in a meaningful way. Another point is this seemingly and indeed political motivation at times behind CVE, and the fact that the measures sometimes are there to help policymakers, or to get them re-elected rather, instead of actually looking for things that are real solutions to real problems. One might also add that these reactions tend to be very quick. Policymakers don't like researches that take a long time. They want solutions which are already made and ready to be implemented, of course, if possible, simple. So just to give you an example from my own experience here in Vienna, when we eventually also had a rather major attack, a jihadi attack last year, one of the first ideas was more or less lock them up. Yeah, like put them in prison and make sure they stay there for a long time. Why even deal with a very complex process of radicalization at all? Or even things like, well, okay, what's wrong with the Muslim community? And this is very sad, because we have had here in Austria actually a very good relationship, or to put it a different way, the Muslim community was just part and is part of the society, and we didn't have the kinds of problems that you guys in the UK are dealing with for a very long time. And it was very sad to see that it was sufficient for an attack to happen to really fall back to those initial patterns of stigmatization, of thinking, what is wrong with this community? What is wrong with Islam? What is wrong with this religion? Another thing, and it's a little bit related, I must say, in this context as well, is the role of research and researchers. Of course, we as human beings are not necessarily always objective. It's even impossible, but we should nevertheless try to be critical and self-reflectant about what we're saying, and not necessarily always supporting policy, which is sometimes difficult because, of course, funding for this kind of research comes from the government, and this is an issue that we've known for a long time, also in relation to terrorism and counter-terrorism in general. So it didn't actually start with 9/11, but it was even before. Another thing that I thought it's important to say is the fact that radicalization and being radical is not necessarily something leading to violence, as you say, but also not necessarily something bad. So, being critical about things, trying to change things is not necessarily something bad. And of course, radicalization and being radical initially had actually historically had a positive connotation. So for example, movements that fought for human rights, for example, were categorized themselves as radical. Another point, the importance of foreign policy in understanding radicalization processes. And this is one of the things that maybe one doesn't think of when talking about process. So process is, of course, a succession of phases, and that's how we understand radicalization now. But it also means that you have various kinds of actors interacting eventually leading to a certain outcome. And foreign policy in this respect is very important. I guess every time somebody talks to a jihadi or a former jihadi, the first thing that comes to mind for them is what the respective state is doing in various Muslim countries. And this, of course, is part of the propaganda, but it's also a very strong motivator for the individual. So, this is a reason to take it very seriously. Another thing is the issue of root causes and them being deterministic, and how this ignores human freedom and human goals. And we have been talking so far about radicalization as being a social process, which I totally agree. But it also has this political component, which you also actually say in the book. So it's about the political goals that individuals have, and which are also very important. Another important, maybe not so obvious thing, the role of randomness. Yeah, and I want to give a quote from your book here. You say, most CV experts, academics, and practitioners overestimate causality and tend to view the world as more explicable than it is. And I fully support this. We always want to have the perfect theory and the perfect model, but we always have to also allow a place for just random things happening, because that's how reality is. Another thing, and I kind of mentioned it before, is the process of radicalization being a social process. And that was actually very nice for me, because that's how I approach radicalization in my first book. You say one is dealing with a socialization process, no different from what occurs in the army, sports teams, and as a broader social experience. And that really has to do very much with the fact that these individuals and the process as such is not necessarily abnormal, or actually is not abnormal. There are parallels, and the question is, of course, what makes it different? But the very important point to start off with is with this rather general take on it being a social process. And related to this, motivation. So, and I think motivation often is left out of the picture, but as you say again in your book, people align themselves with violent extremist organizations for emotional, pragmatic, rational, or opportunistic considerations. Yes, it is very varied. It's very difficult to put it in a model or a theory, but it's important to also look at this end of the spectrum, not just the causes, but also the motivations, the goals of the individuals. And finally, this is something that we also see in a couple of other European countries, how policy often relates to the Muslim community and not, first of all, not relating or not establishing contact with the whole of it, but only with certain individuals, and usually individuals who are, for example, ex-Muslims, right, or formers in some way or another. So individuals who are very willing to be in line with what policy wants or what certain political actors want. And this is again something which is very counterproductive, because you alienate again the Muslim community, which actually should be a natural ally in your fight against extremism. So now I have my devil's advocate questions. So taking on board this idea of focusing on root causes and structural causes, doesn't this sound then a little bit apologetic for individuals who eventually engage in acts of violence, which are very shocking, to put it mildly? Not all of them, but some of them. For example, you mentioned the Beatles in your, not the band, the jihadis in your book. And then again, taking on board the fact that ideology is perhaps not as important as structural factors and grievances, then again, you have a whole passage about the importance of Wahhabism. And my question is, how do we reconcile these? What is the role of Wahhabism actually? What is the role of certain countries such as Saudi Arabia in all this? And when arguing that Salafism doesn't have to lead to violence, it's not as important as other factors, but how do we deal with it? Do we just ignore it? Especially knowing, as I just said, that is something, you know, that didn't naturally develop in European countries, but was something pushed from outside very consciously by certain countries. And finally, well, actually not finally, thirdly, one gets the feeling sometimes in your book that jihadism is, and actually is, a revolutionary movement, a resistance movement, but what do we do with it then? I mean, do we legitimize it in any way? Do we try to integrate it in some way in a political process? Do we just accept it as it is? We're trying to change it? And what is the role of religion then? Is there no role in it? Of course, the parallels to other types of radicalization are far greater than the differences, but still, what is the role of religion? Oh yeah, and actually something that I would like to have your thoughts on, but not necessarily now, because I'm sure that we have other questions. And again, don't feel pressure to answer to these things, because we want to prioritize the questions of the public, but I just wanted to throw them out there. We often hear the argument, we shouldn't talk about Islamophobia, or we shouldn't even use this term, because then we strengthen the Islamist actors, the propaganda of the Islamists. Yeah, so this is something that we hear, for example, here very often. And just quickly, in the time that I have left, the things that came to mind as you were talking just before, about counter narratives and ideology. And I fully agree with the fact that you can't actually fight an ideology. Ideology is there. You can't just, it's not like fighting poverty. You can't just erase. However, if we think not about ideology, but about frames, so, ways in which things are presented, and perhaps in that context, it makes sense to think about counter narratives, about counter framing certain things, and not just leave it to the various extremist organizations to do the framing. The other thing I was thinking about choice, when you said it's not a choice, well, it probably depends. So, certain people are actually forced to become members of terrorist organizations. And I fully agree that in some cases, it's the less worse choice, as it were. But still it's a choice, because otherwise you take away again the freedom of the individual if there's no choice. And then I think I had another thing, but oh yeah. Well, you said that push factors are not so much considered in policy, and I think it again depends, because we have, for example, a number of EU calls, EU projects that specifically focus on on root causes. And recently I've even seen things like inequalities, and I very much welcome that. However, at the national level, it's true that especially in some countries, there's an focus especially on ideology and especially on religion. Even if they talk about push factors in terms of structural issues, it's still made to sound as if it was specific to Muslims. So, you know, yet another problem that Muslims have. They are not able to get themselves educated, to integrate, and so forth. So yeah, that's my input for today. Thank you very much. And yeah, I give the floor to the next commentator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Tahir, I just wanted to check, would you like to take a few minutes to respond to some of Daniela's points now, or shall we go to Tufail and then you can maybe respond to both before Q&A?
Let's go to Tufail and then I'll respond to both. Thank you.
Then Tufail, the floor is over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the ICCT and to Tahir for the opportunity. I just wanted to begin by congratulating Tahir on the publication of his book. I've really enjoyed reading it. For as long as I can remember, Tahir has been at the forefront of policy discussions and debates which are strongly informed by social science and research evidence, perhaps reflecting his own background as somebody who's both worked in government, in academia, and with think tanks. I think his book provides a concise and nuanced overview and reflection of the CV policy and research field that's reaching its teenage years in many ways. And like many late teenagers looking back on the music and fashion choices that seem so relevant and promising in earlier days, CV research, as Tahir shows, is questioning what to keep and what to discard. My own sort of contribution to this field began back in 2007 when I was struck by the fact that CV, PV policy was being developed, particularly targeting Muslim communities in the UK in the largely evidence-free zone, pushed mainly by small groups of think tanks and individual, what I'd call policy entrepreneurs. And as a researcher at the time who'd been working for almost a decade on issues of discrimination, integration, and cohesion, I was struck by the lack of engagement with social science researchers. Many of them stayed away from radicalization because they thought that's not the main primary concern of Muslim communities. They had bigger structural issues to consider, and others didn't want to be involved in the securitization. And it was in that context that I became involved in kind of writing about whether government at the time should support Muslim communities through its work on PVE, and I wrote a piece for DCLG at the time, which summarized the existing research and basically concluded that the research showed that it's very complex. And I remember speaking to Jeff Mulligan, who was at the time was the director of Number 10 Policy Unit, who said, you know, for every complex problem, there's a simple solution. The problem is it's usually wrong. I think Tahir's book shows how both the problems are complex, and he suggests ways in which you can develop solutions that are complex as well. And I think that's where its real strength is. But I wanted to begin with a sort of provocative suggestions that are here, which is that all of this is premised on the idea that you can, in fact, counter or prevent radicalization. But what if you can't? What if, and I was sort of struck by a piece of work by Professor Kassam at Warwick University, a philosopher, who talked about complex particulars. He says, well, what if radicalization is a complex particular? That is, you can talk to somebody who's engaged in violence, find out what led them to violence, but that has no predictive value for anybody else. And therefore, you can't have a set of policies around predicting who's going to be involved in violence, if that's what you're interested in. You can have so you can't really have those kinds of policies. And I think Mark Sageman, in the recent work, pointed towards a similar suggestion when he noted the sort of base rate, what he called the extremely low base rate of terrorism. So he suggested that for every 1,000 people who are false positives, you might end up with one genuine positive. So you've got a massively low base rate, and you've got a huge alienation effect of all of those people who are false positives. So what then is the policy implication for saying that actually you can't predict radicalization? You can't have policies that effectively can counter radicalization? Where does that leave policymakers? And I guess that also, reflects, and you may have had the same experience at conferences where the academic researchers will tell you there is no profile, and the policymakers will nod along and think, okay, yes, there is no profile, but that's not really helpful to us, except for the one person who says, well, okay, there are some indicators, and then they will write them all down, even though they've caveated it, nuanced it, showing how, but you need something, because you're telling policymakers that there isn't a solution to the problem they're looking for, or we can't provide a concrete scientifically evidence solution, isn't helpful to them. So what role then is there for researchers, and how do we deal with that challenge? And so that was my first kind of provocative suggestion, is that can we actually counter radicalization? If we can't, where should policy then focus? Should it therefore focus much more on criminal justice, on people who are doing things that are unlawful, as opposed to people who might be on their way towards doing things? And this relates to two other comments I want to make. One is what you see as the role of human rights in all of this, and particularly understanding and implications of PCV policies. So for a long time, from my perspective, I guess, as a human rights lawyer, the human rights have been an interesting area where governments have justified CT policy on the basis they're protecting a fundamental right, the right to life. They've also identified the violations of human rights as one of those conditions conducive to radicalization. So where states violate human rights, that's also contributes towards radicalization. And yet the sort of analysis of the human rights implications of PV, CV policies has been quite limited, and for understandable reasons. Most lawyers and human rights activists are focused on those things which are more hard-edged infringements, the restrictions on liberty, the criminal justice process, criminal law enforcement, administrative measures that detain people, restrict their freedom. Whereas CV has always been seen as a softer policy, one that doesn't really, or the infringement of human rights are much more nuanced there. And partly it's because those rights that are infringed, freedom of religion, freedom of belief, assembly, association, privacy, are qualified rights. So you can always justify interfering with those rights in the name of national security, and challenging them in the courts is also more difficult, because courts and the judiciary will understandably provide a degree of deference to the executive's judgment on national security matters as to whether that interference was justified or not. So finding a violation is difficult. So much of that human rights analysis of CVE has been around the chilling impact, or the potential chilling of people's engagement and enjoyment of their human rights. But I think it's becoming increasingly clear, particularly, and I think you mentioned this in the book, is the sort of the globalization of counter-radicalization, is that it's now become a genie that's been let out of its bottle, and that every country in the world through the UN is mandated to have these counter-radicalization policies, and yet it's a policy that has no definitions at its core, either terrorism, extremism, or radicalization. And of course, when you have the UN on the one hand mandating states to have these policies, but leaving states to define who are the extremists, who are the radicals, who are the terrorists, then not surprisingly, states are using these against their domestic opponents. So they're used against minorities, against women's rights organizations, against environmental activists. And it's on the international level, watching quite closely the recent review of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism strategy, it was quite clear that states are enjoying the fact that they have been given this blue light to go ahead and have a whole set of policies. I mean, from China's perspective, what they're doing in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs is just one big counter-radicalization policy. It's kind of informed by ideas of radicalization and extremism and the need to de-radicalize people. And so we've kind of created this structure that we can't put the genie back in the bottle. So to what extent can we use human rights in this context to critique radicalization and counter-radicalization policies? And related to that, I guess my other sort of comment on the book is that because it focuses on counter-radicalization, I mean, it's not a criticism, it's more sort of observation, because it focuses on counter-radicalization, it perhaps doesn't place it in the context of the other policies, so the law enforcement and the administrative measures, whereas I think in some ways those have to be seen as part of a set of policies that interact and align and counteract with each other. And I think just to give you one example where I think this becomes problematic is that as well as promoting counter-radicalization policies, both the UN and other global institutions have also been promoting or requiring states, in fact, through the Security Council, to have to change their criminal law policy. So the UN has sort of required states to have criminalize certain forms of conduct around terrorism. And these are what we call preemptive offenses. So they're offenses, the core thing that terrorists do, killing people, destroying property, already criminal law. These are things to do with actions which in and of themselves aren't culpable or harmful. So traveling for terrorist purposes, acts preparatory to terrorism, public provocation of terrorism. In a lot of these offenses, the action itself, in and of itself, isn't a harmful act. So this raises challenges for criminal law philosophy. But therefore, the onus of the wrong is on the intention. It's why the person is doing it, and they're doing it for terrorist purposes. That traveling is getting on the tube, getting on the bus, getting on the tube or the bus in order to become a foreign fighter. The mental element, the intention, makes it the criminal offense, not the actual action. The challenge then is that the things that are used to evidence that intention are the same things that are used to identify people for counter-radicalization measures. So it'll be the fact they view or download extremist material. It'll be the views that they have, the association that they have, the people that they interact with, all of those things, which are often used as evidence as to why somebody should go into a de-radicalization program, is also the same thing that's evidence for their intention to be a terrorist as well. And so I think the criminal justice element has kind of overlaps. And in some ways, the idea that CVE is pre-crime, I think, is actually fails to understand just how much the criminal law is actually now pre-crime as well. So much of the criminal law is now pre-crime that there's hardly any space that's left that's pre-crime for CVE to be pre-criminal or preemptive. So those are my sort of three main observations. I know that there are lots of people who are asking questions. I think I'd want to leave it at that and perhaps participate in the discussion as it develops. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tufil, and thank you, Daniela, for those observations, remarks, questions, and queries. Let's start in reverse order. I think, Tufil, you picked out a lot of the issues around human rights, which is obviously something that you know far more about, and all of these challenges around how we see law, how we see CVE in terms of the pre-crime is very, very, very important and sensitive to try and work through. And the wider question around, can you do anything about radicalization at all? I think it relates to aspects of what Daniela was saying, that obviously some radicalization is healthy for liberal democracies. We need radicalization of not the violent extremist kind, but the premise for what will ultimately become progressive social policy. And we have histories of that documented across Europe in the post-war period. So some element of radicalization, as it were, is healthy for democracies. And I think we've always known that. But there is such a framing around what we see in this the post 9/11 war on terror period in relation to Islamist radicalization that it's got much heavier connotations, and it's linked to all of the problems that we know very well about that were very much in play before the events of 9/11 and have accelerated. And they're in the context of polarities and questions of inequality and widening social divisions. And with that, also the lack of adequate political participation and engagement, and also the manufacturing of monsters in the media on a daily basis, and the alignment between the different aspects of dominant politics and dominant media. And they share far more than not, as the case may be. We sometimes talk about the 4 Ps in the prevent strategy, and the 5th P being provoke, which is the Daily Mail. So that there is that element to consider, that there are these wider contextual factors in terms of politics and media, as well as the social lived realities of Muslims in Europe. And so the question about whether I'm kind of being an apologist for the actual instances of Muslims who say, I'm a Muslim and I'm an extremist and I'm off to do some radicalization, understand me, find solutions for me. It's not to necessarily dismiss that, but it's important to try and emphasize the fact that we have a spectrum of so-called participants in this, where the vast majority are foot soldiers with limited or no knowledge of the religion, its faith, its practices, And they do what they do born out of complete frustration at all sorts of levels, including at the kind of wider macro structural level, but also as well as the local area community level. And therefore, what we have is issues of capacity within the Muslim community to govern a lot of these issues. And it's not about the potential for extremism suddenly emerging. It's the lack of capacity to do with the lack of resources, the lack of investment by state authorities, the complete neglect on the part of the state when it comes to Muslim minority communities, in particular urban areas, which link to historical issues of urban policy and housing policy and wider social policy. So Muslims have been abandoned effectively by the state. And so a lot of what I want to try and emphasize in sort of critiquing countering violent extremism is that we've put the cart before the horse. We've taken away essential understandings of the fact that these are citizens of our states, that they have rights, and we have legal responsibilities as a state, as it were, and that integration is something that is a responsibility on the part of the state, but also for communities. And it's a two-way process. The communities can't do it on their own. And this fighting off this constant battle on a daily basis, being sort of penned into some of the poorer areas, more likely to face all sorts of structural problems. I mean, the COVID pandemic has revealed all of how unequal and fragile our economies are, and the UK being very much exposed at this, and the structural realities of life facing minorities, including Muslim minorities, are ongoing considerations. And before 9/11, there was a bit of an attempt to try and understand these as social, political, economic problems, and let's work towards joined up solutions, etc. But the 9/11 events, which occurred months after the northern disturbances, sort of diluted a lot of that, and it became a problem of Muslims, for Muslims, by Muslims, etc. And that has maintained itself in the light of ongoing concerns around the far right and other forms of extremism. Wahhabism, Salafism. Well, not all of Salafism is bad. We know of the quietists, the ones who are prepared to accept and carry out their roles in democracies, but they may choose to live a separate life, may not choose to engage fully, and may adapt and adopt conservative values, but they don't necessarily mean that they're inherent or a problem for society per se. And strong, successful societies can absorb certain differences. And the fact that we can't is an indication that we are weak monocultural societies with all sorts of problems of nationalism coming to the fore. Wahhabism, now, this is also a kind of a parallel story, because we know that a lot of this radicalization comes from outside. It's not within the experience of a lot of the community, say the Moroccans who tend to get profiled in Europe, and the Pakistanis in the UK context. It's outside of their religious community experiences. But a lot of that has been going on due to the lack of real attention on the part of our state elites, and all sorts of ongoing relations between Western powers and Gulf state powers, which are all about money, banking, finance, arms, and trade. And those relations are very, very important for nation states who would rather not look at all of that very closely. We know that there are implications coming out of the sort of Gulf states for what emerged in terms of the Islamic State, which are important also to be reminded of. So there are obviously, there's no hard and fast on how to deal with radicalization, if we can deal with it at all. And perhaps, yes, some elements of radicalization are healthy and necessary. But the point is, I think the situation is that when we have extremism and terrorism, the state tends to dive in full hog. It's part of the nature of the whole CT sector. And unless we, as active thinkers and policy community types, academic types, get into the mix and actively challenge this. And it's not the case that, and I understand your observation, Daniela, that the politicians who are looking to headlines, the UK current government, it's run by journalists who look to the headlines and only that. But there are some excellent activities within institutions, government departments, ministries that have the research, have the knowledge, have the perspectives intact, but the policymakers pick and choose. And so those are issues that we also have to deal with directly and indirectly. But it's often very difficult for civil servant colleagues who are silenced just because they're civil servants within a large, protracted government department with all sorts of internal politics. So there's lots that communities can do themselves to respond to this, but they need to be empowered and supported by the state. And there is only one language that the state speaks to its Muslim communities about, and that's also a problem. We need to talk about everyday concerns around housing, health, integration, equality. Discussions that were very much on the table before the events of 9/11, but of course completely disappeared. And now multiculturalism is seen as a route into potential securitization. I'm mindful that we have only so much time left, and I would like to hear from others and also to hear from my colleagues to see if they've got anything else. But thank you both, Daniela and Tefal, for those thought-provoking and detailed comments and observations.
Great, thank you all. Yes, and we've already gotten some really great questions coming in. So I think in order to try to make it a little bit more interactive, what we're going to do is I'm going to perhaps select some of the questions that have come in, and on our technology side, those speakers will be unmuted. And so if you can ask your question sort of in person rather than me reading it out, I think that will be a bit more dynamic. So perhaps first I can go over to Eric Ponceau for your question, if you are able to ask it, Eric.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm just going to read my question because everything is already written down. Some psychologists and psychiatrists argue that many people face difficult living conditions, and yet very few of them do radicalize. And from that, they conclude that radicalization cannot be explained by social conditions. How do you respond to that? Keeping in mind that, of course, it's not always so black and white, and there are other mental health experts that are much more nuanced.
I'm not sure if I caught all of that question. While I'm trying to think through it, perhaps Daniela or Tefal have a remark on that.
Just very quickly, I think that was part of the point that I was also making, that all of the explanations that are provided for radicalization, Tony Blair famously said, well, lots of people are angry about foreign policy, but not everybody who's angry becomes violent. That applies to every causal factor. Lots of people have an extremist ideology, but not everybody who does becomes violent. Lots of people experience poverty, and not everybody who is poor becomes violent. So therefore, that's the challenge in this area, is that all of the causal factors affect a far greater number of people than the actual tiny number of people who are involved in violence. So I think that the point is well made.
Well, if I might just intervene real quickly with something from your book, which is the keyword situation. So basically what you're saying there, and I think also others, but I think it's really well written in the book in this sense, is that basically regarding both push and pull factors, you can say that, there's other people affected by them, but they don't join, right? Or on the other hand, you can say the people who join who are not affected by these factors, such as, for example, people who are well educated, well off, and so forth. And the argument made is basically that you have to consider the situation also involving the recruiting actor. So considering that you have a pool of individuals with certain vulnerabilities in the sense of their situation or background, not necessarily psychological, but that's not enough, of course. You have to have these agents, and this comes, I think it's very useful to think about social movements in this case, and about the entrepreneurs in the social movement, so the individuals, the ideologues, or the managers even in the social movement, who go out there and start recruiting people out of this pool. So the idea is not just to think about the individual and the cause, but think about the system, perhaps, the situation, the context, and all the other actors who interact and take advantage, perhaps, of this situation, of the background of the individual.
Yeah, agreed. And while we have structural and individual, there are still going to be particular triggers, and that's going to be unique to every single case. And that's why it's so difficult to generalize, and that's why all these sort of Venn diagrams of different sort of realms of possibility come into play. Individual level triggers is probably what we'll end up agreeing on as being probably the most important, but then there are issues there as well with that.
Great, thank you. Perhaps next I can ask Natasha Gorley if you can come off of mute, and perhaps I know you had submitted 2 questions, so maybe if you can kind of quickly touch upon both aspects, and then the 3 can respond.
Hello, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my questions. I'm currently writing a master's dissertation on this topic, so it's been a really interesting discussion. Yes, as Julie said, I had 2 questions that are kind of based on policymakers' responses to the issues that we've talked about. The first one is, I've been looking at some of the topics that we've been talking about today in terms of Islamophobia, the social and historical issues like colonialism, failed integration, whether it's British multiculturalism or French like assimilation and laïcité, and how these things kind of impact radicalization. As we've talked about, community engagement obviously plays a really important role in combating these issues. However, when exploring these sorts of policies, I've come up against how these kind of policies can often be seen as securitizing integration, especially looking at Prevent in the UK. So I guess one question I had is, how can policymakers engage with communities in meaningful ways, minority communities, but I suppose without problematically muddling together counter-terrorism community engagement? My second question, if you have time, is more about the problem of radicalization in prisons. In France and the UK, Muslims make up a disproportionate amount of the prison population, and radicalization in prison is facilitated by, I suppose, prisoners' marginalization and that physical removal from the mainstream. And of course, being in prison can increase the negative perceptions that may already exist about the state. So that was just another thing that I've come up against in my research. How do we tackle that problem as well? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Natasha. I mean, I think it's important to emphasize that when the sort of war on terror started, and then we had the emergence of Prevent, Muslim communities were actively part of that discussion and debate. British Muslim communities were as moved by the idea that you have British-born Muslims engaged in terrorism, extremism, as the state was, as majority of society was. So there was a level of interaction, and there was a meeting of minds, if you like, around these topics. But then the government view became narrower and narrower. And then there was a narrow perspective on who the government wanted to talk to. And as Daniela pointed out, you get these formers and you project them, and this is what you need to become, and follow their path. But these formers tend to have some problems, indeed. So what to do when the state starts to close the doors on you? I mean, that's effectively what happened. And I think, and then as that process goes on, it continues to disempower and disillusion and marginalize communities. And so we've seen a huge widening of these gaps over this period. And I'm not sure exactly what works well, because historically also political participation has been sort of manipulated by political parties when it comes to getting block book votes, in particular northern and Midland areas in the times of the 70s and 80s. And it sort of effectively disempowers minority communities because they've got interlocutors who've been put there. Although that's rapidly changing, we've seen a different type of political representation today. It's a challenge I'm not entirely sure. And radicalization, sometimes in prison, sometimes inmates get radicalized because it's a way of survival. It's a way of maintaining some sort of safety and security. We've seen in the Dutch context that there's a maximum security prison that has the far right and the Islamists in the same prisons, or the same prison wing rather. And the attempt is that they get familiar with each other and share with each other, and then sort of disqualify each other's hate, if you like. And it's an experiment, and I think the Dutch are very sort of positive about what's been going on with it so far, but it's unclear as to how it would pan out, especially once they leave prison and enter back into society. We also know that de-radicalization programs have been problematic in prisons as well. And once people leave, things have gone badly. So it's not entirely working in whether it's government engagement with communities or whether it's in prisons. So yeah, perhaps my colleagues have got some ideas in terms of solutions. I've only got ideas for more problems.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead, Daniela.
Okay, thanks. So about the issue of prisons, it depends on the country. So what you indeed have in countries such as France is not so much historical, not so much interest, or not. Basically, de-radicalization was not a priority, and definitely not in prison. So what you had there is a situation where former generations of terrorists would radicalize newer ones. So talking about the 90s, even starting with the 90s. But what we definitely do not have much in most of the countries is a really good system of transition management. So the things that you're doing in the prison and the things that you're doing perhaps afterwards. So the problem is that some individuals come out of prison and they go out and do a terror attack like here in Vienna, or they do something else, they end up in prison again, because there's often a disconnect between the kinds of measures in the prison and then the ones outside. In some cases, there are no measures outside, or there are not sufficient measures in the prison either. So what you need to have is a system that really guides and accompanies the individual from day one. And this is something that also we are trying to work now within a project, but it's more like a future thing. We don't actually have now a multi-agency approach to de-radicalizing, or at least disengaging individuals in prison that really covers the period in prison and afterwards as well. And just about community engagement, there's this nice word of whole of society, doing prevention, whole of society, whole of government, which means that basically it's an issue that concerns everybody and not just certain communities or certain religions or ethnicities. And if you have this kind of broad approach, then it's actually arguably easier for also Muslim communities to engage, because they don't have the finger pointing to them. You have to do something about it, but it's a common effort where they are actors among others. Sorry.
I think you've picked up on a really interesting point and it's about how identifying something as a national security measure becomes stigmatizing because it's identified as a national security measure. So many of the policies that are undertaken through Prevent and other such policies in and of themselves aren't problematic. So the government spent a lot of money, particularly early on, doing a lot of work on community capacity building, leadership development projects, women's empowerment projects. In and of themselves, they weren't bad things. The problem is when they become part of a national security measure, because I think inherent in the idea of the national security measure is that this policy is being developed and targeted because the group that it's targeted at is seen as a threat to national security, and that in itself is another rising process. I think that's where the challenge is. In some ways, the prevention of radicalization of terrorism should be the outcome of lots of other things being done well, but the challenge, the paradox of policy is that when something is a threat to national security, it gets prioritized within government, but at the same time it gets stigmatized when it's actually implemented. Whereas if something, good educational outcomes are a good thing, and employment is a good thing, so they should be done irrespective of whether they prevent radicalization. The problem is the government often requires it to be a threat to national security before it prioritizes certain projects or processes, and I think that's where government needs to think through what it's doing. And the other challenge, and this was sort of based on research that I did a few years ago, almost a decade ago now, is that the state's understanding of threat and community's understanding of threat are completely different. So a state-centric view of threat is that if you've got 3,000 people that you're looking out for, then that's really hard and that's really challenging, because any one of those could be involved in violence. But if you're in the community of 3,000 people are invisible to you, whereas somebody selling drugs on your street corner is much more visible. So I think the state has to engage with communities with what they see as threats to their everyday safety and security, and not necessarily expect them automatically to understand or even appreciate or to agree with the threat that the state sees, because that threat is invisible to most people in most communities, because the numbers in that larger context are so small.
All right, thank you. I think we have time, and apologies that we're not going to make it, I think, to all of the questions, but there's one question that came in. I believe the individual is no longer on the call, but perhaps it's a good note to end on. The question is that, taking account of the very valid critiques of the current CVE approach or paradigm, are there any alternatives of CVE that is being done right or being done better? Are there any credible alternative approaches that we see being implemented that, the global community or Europe in particular can learn from in terms of implementing some of the recommendations to here maybe that you touched upon?
Well, I think in brief, I think when we see successful CVE projects, they're effectively community development and empowerment and capacity building projects. We used to call these projects these things before 9/11, and there was funding available. You didn't have to take a CVE box to get funding to run a women's business council, for example. So so in effect, there is a kind of natural response through empowerment and engagement and challenging various discourses within. But as Tefel rightly just said now, that if you want to do this today, you have to tick a box that's saying that this is complying with some CVE measure. And that the whole securitization and the pre-crime thought and the alienation just makes the whole situation a lot worse. If we got rid of countering violent extremism and talked about empowerment and capacity building, which is the language we used for minority marginalized communities before 9/11, the same sets of communities, even the same policies around, for the Muslim communities, there was something called connecting communities in 1999 from the Home Office. It focused on imams, women, youth empowerment, and media engagement. This was a specific set of policies that came after 9/11 around empowering Muslims, but through a countering violent extremism lens. So the CVE bit is the add-on. What's really needed is good old-fashioned community development.
Daniela or Tufel, do you have anything further to add on that point?
What do we do instead of CVE to do CVE?
$1 million question, so to speak.
I mean, the only addition I'd make is that I think part of the challenge is the lack of effective evaluation of anything that's connected to CVE. So we don't actually know what works. And there's a question of how we measure what works. Is it just a question of throughput? How many people have gone through this program? Is that your measure of effectiveness? Is it measured? So I think that's one of the core challenges, is how a huge amount of money is being spent. And there has to be a point at which you say, well, is this an effective use of public resources, given how scarce public resources are going to be coming out of a pandemic?
Well, perhaps just a small point. I think prioritizing maybe more prevention rather than countering, and of course also along the lines of what was said already, but also because in the end it's more sustainable. So it's more difficult to do, and it's more expensive, and it's more complex, but it saves you the trouble of the countering later on. And I think this argument is not made enough, perhaps, or not understood enough at certain levels. And also what we see sometimes, and that's not necessarily something to do with Islamist radicalization, it's more having to do with far right. I think we have a situation, and this is a different argument to the one that was said before. We might have a situation where we actually have to think about the whole society in addressing some of the things that have become mainstream discourse, and old racism becoming cultural racism and becoming something that is acceptable to say on the street. And these things are beyond PCVE, these things that you need to do at school already. So various levels or various problems.
No, thank you very much. And yeah, one of the questions that we didn't get to was indeed the role of educators. So I think, Daniela, you sort of touched upon there at the end, the need for these things to be sort of already inculcated, at schools. I think that leaves us sort of at the end. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but I just wanted to again thank all three of you, and to hear in particular. I mean, I think your book touches upon sort of all of the really fundamental questions that we're as a field facing in this moment, particularly at the 20-year anniversary of 9/11, but particularly in light of the events that we've seen unfold in Afghanistan, and sort of reflecting are we better off, or has the field been able to move beyond our approach of 20 years ago, or are we in fact back at square one? So the sort of thought-provoking questions that were raised today, I'm sure will be things that we all continue to grapple with. But certainly this was a really insightful discussion. And so thank you all again. And thank you for all of the attendees who joined today. And again, this will be available on YouTube. So, please feel free to share it around your networks. All right. Thank you again.
Thank you all. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everybody.